Yeah.
So I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. We're about to get started. I want to introduce myself. My name is Manny Corlew. I'm the Community Events and Partnerships Manager here at Consensus, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. This webinar is presented by Consensus. Consensus is leading the world into a new era of demo automation. Our platform gets your buyers what they need when they need it, and it then multiplies your revenue team's impact with unique insights on those buyers. As a result, you'll see faster close times, larger deals, and higher close rates. You can learn more at goconsensus.com. It's not too late. I just want to throw this in here. Demo Fest was an amazing event this year, and this content is still available for you. All the recordings are live now on the platform, and if you want to access those, I'm going to drop into the chat later where you can access those recordings. We also want to let you know that we're getting back out there on the road with DFX. We had a great time in San Francisco in February, and we can't wait to bring the event to London and New York City again later this year. You can now go and register and join us for either one of these events or both, which I recommend, and I'll post a link in the chat for that opportunity. Now, I just want to, before we get started, dive into some housekeeping options for you. If you need to speak with us at any time, you can post in the chat. There also is a section for QA, but you're welcome to post your questions at any time throughout this presentation, and Ben and I will try our best to get to those. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please press the help button on the right side of your screen. And now I want to introduce our speaker. Ben comes to us today with a wealth of experience in coaching and mentoring tech teams for over 2 decades. Now the founder of Elevated You, Ben takes a deeper dive into what technical professionals need to develop their human skills. And with that, I want to turn over the rest of my time and the presentation over to you, Ben.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Manny. What a lovely introduction. Let me share my screen and get everything rolling. Okay, Manny, can you see the screen? Are we all golden?
You're looking good.
Excellent. Right, and I'm going to minimize the chat. So, Manny, I'm going to rely on your voice. If there's anything going wrong or if anything happens, I'm going to rely on your voice. I am not a multitasker, and I find that the chat will just distract me terribly. So, I'm not in chat, folks. If you're typing in chat, Manny's going to be going through the chat and looking through things. Let's get started. Let's talk about the GOAT of pre-sales. If Cameron Tucker and Lieutenant Commander Data had a baby. Now, before we get into the topic, let me introduce myself. So my name is Ben Pierce, as Manny said, and I spent about 20 years working at Microsoft. And about 10 of those years, I was in customer-facing technical roles. And about 10 of those years, I was leading high-performing teams, customer-facing technical teams, doing pre-sales, professional services, all kinds of things at Microsoft. So that's kind of my background. And then about getting on for 2 years ago, I felt I want to try something new. I'm a little bit bored. And I started my own company, Elevated You, which is all about helping people in the tech world develop their human skills. So that's a little bit about me. Let me introduce the rest of the cast. Okay, I say the cast because my title, the GOAT of pre-sales, if Cameron Tucker and Lieutenant Commander Data had a baby, that baby would be the GOAT of pre-sales. Let me introduce the cast, and if you're not really into sports, the parlance of what a GOAT is. So let me start with the cast. So we've got Cameron Tucker. Cameron Tucker is from a show, Modern Family, one of my favorite shows. I must have watched it from start to finish several times. I've watched it with my wife, and now my daughter's starting to get into it. So I think I'm watching it for a third time, probably, with my daughter. And in there, if you've not watched it, you've got this chap. It's won loads of awards. It's really famous, right? There is this chap, Cameron Tucker, and the thing that you need to know about Cameron Tucker is he is the most hyper emotional person that you could come across. Really caring, really empathetic, and he's hilarious. He's, for me, one of the stars of the show. So you've got Cameron Tucker, who is from Modern Family, really emotional, creates really strong emotional connections with people. I'm going to take you to another show from my childhood, Star Trek: The Next Generation. I'm sure lots of you have seen this. It used to be on a Wednesday night in the UK, and I remember I'd watch it as a kid. You had all those characters, Jean-Luc Picard, and of course you had in there Lieutenant Commander Data. And Lieutenant Commander Data, if you've not seen the show, was an android. Okay, so he wasn't even a real human. He was an android that looked like a human. And he's a bit like the Spock successor, for those of you that might have seen Star Trek, the original. You know, he was super logical, super rational, and very data-driven. And everything he would talk about, and he was trying to become more human. That was kind of the storyline as we went through the show. But he was always logical, rational, and data-driven. And so now what we're going to be thinking about today is, well, what if they had a baby? Now, of course they can't, because one's a robot and all kinds of things. But what I'm going to say to you is that that child, if they got all the best bits of Cameron Tucker and all the best bits of Lieutenant Commander Data, that child would be the greatest of all time in the pre-sales world. Because this idea of being able to fuse logic, data, strong argument with emotional connection, empathy, you put those together, and that is a dangerous weapon, shall we say. That is an amazing combination. So I'm going to put it to you that that child would be the greatest pre-sales of all time. So let's start to think about, what am I going to talk about in more detail, and how's this going to start to help you in your career? Well, it seems to me that when we're working in pre-sales, there's lots of things we need to do and be really good. But some of those things include being able to influence people, being able to affect their behavior. We need to be able to persuade people, to induce someone to do something, use our solution, buy our product, that kind of stuff. And we also, because we're in the, often that we're the technical part of the sales conversation, we need to be able to explain stuff, and we need to be able to make stuff easy to understand. And what I'm really going to be thinking about is how we bring that to life, and some tools and some tips and some tricks that we can use to get better at those things. So that's what we're going to be thinking about for the next 40 minutes or so. Let's start by going right back in time, thousands of years, to Aristotle. Aristotle came up with the 3 means of persuasion. And I know in the chat before I started talking, Darren had mentioned a podcast I do. And on that podcast, I had Mark, who works for Consensus, and we were talking together about Aristotle and the 3 means of persuasion. And what Aristotle said, some of you might know this, is that for you to persuade people, you need to be credible. Okay, so that might come from a bit of experience, the way you present things, the gravitas you show when you're talking. So you need to be credible. You need to make an emotional connection with people. And you need a strong rationale, a great logical argument. That was what Aristotle said. If you get those 3 things right, you're going to be able to really effectively persuade people. And throughout today, we're going to be looking at particularly that emotion and that rationale part. So if I start to put that into the cast of today, Cameron Tucker represents this emotional connection piece, and Lieutenant Commander Data represents this rational. And what we're going to do over the next few minutes is think about each of those. What can we do about, what skills can we build about how we build an emotional connection with people, and what skills can we build about how we build a logical argument and explain that to people. So we're going to start off by thinking about the emotional connection. So we're going to start off by thinking about this Cameron Tucker idea, this idea of how do we build our skills where we're caring, empathetic, and are able to build an emotional connection with our customers, our prospects, our stakeholders. And there's two areas that we're going to go through. We're going to think about how you create an emotional connection by exercising curiosity and by listening effectively. And we're going to think about how we do it by telling stories. So those are the two approaches we're going to look at about how we build an emotional connection with people. So let's start off with this idea of exercising curiosity and listening. Now, imagine your favorite rom-com, okay, your favorite romantic comedy. And imagine you've got the female lead in there, the male lead in there, like there is here. And imagine, I can just imagine a character, the female lead, maybe somebody like Drew Barrymore, something like that, or Sandra Bullock, something like that. And you can imagine, they go on a date and she's like, we had such a connection. He was so interested in me. Maybe you can imagine the scene. And basically, what this comes down to is creating this emotional connection is about asking questions, and then this is the crucial bit, then listening to the answers. And when we start to move this to the business world, we start to call that active listening. How do we listen? And this was a skill I had to learn, if I'm really honest. And it's a skill you can develop. And so I'm just going to go through a couple of steps that really, I think, help you show to the people that you want to influence that you are listening and that you care. So, active listening. Active listening, I think, comes down to these things: paying attention, showing you're listening, mirroring the energy that they're showing you, asking questions and clarifying the things that they're saying to you, and then summarizing and playing back the things that they've said to you. And if you do these things to the other person, to the speaker, I guess I'll call them for the duration of this, to the speaker, it feels like you are listening, like you are connected to them. And that often leads to this idea of them thinking there's a great emotional connection. So let's start with paying attention, right? Which sounds really obvious and really easy. But these things make it a lot harder. Now, if my internet bandwidth is up to it, hopefully what you can see is somebody scrolling through a phone and somebody typing on an old-fashioned typewriter. You might be getting 1 frame a second. I don't know. You might be getting a full video. But this is so important. It's the foundation of all the others. You actually need to pay attention and focus. And the world is setting us up not to be able to do that. So remove some of those things that hinder you. Often phones, get them out, get them out, because I'm tempted to look at them. I'm tempted to read at them, particularly if it's a group conversation that's going on. And when we're on Teams or Zoom or Google or whatever your video conference of choice is, the idea that you start doing email, the idea that you start surfing the web, whatever it might be, people on the Teams calls, they can see your eyes. They know you're not really listening. So it's this idea of paying attention, removing distractions, and getting to a point where you're able to actually genuinely listen to people and you're not distracted. So that's the first really important thing. Second thing, show people you're listening. So don't overdo it, but make a bit of eye contact, occasionally nod your head a little bit, make a few listening noises. It just helps people know that you're listening. Pay attention and outwardly show folks that you're listening. Next one, excuse me, is mirror the energy. If someone is telling you something super exciting, they're going to be more animated in their delivery. So match that energy with the way you show that you're listening. If somebody is telling you something very serious and very heartfelt, if you're grinning like a Cheshire cat and waving your arms about all over the place, that doesn't help build the connection. So mirror the energy that is being shown to you. Next thing, clarify and question. Ask really pertinent questions at relevant times, and it helps the interaction become more of a conversation and less of a monologue. from the speaker, and it shows people that you're paying attention. It injects energy. It makes the speaker feel like they're heard. Not only that, but it helps you get clarity on some of the finer details that you might be going through. So clarifying question. And then the other thing, and I like doing this, is the summarize. So if you're able to hear something, internalize it, and then play it back using different words to the person that was speaking to you. Firstly, it shows them that you've been listening and understood it, but also it helps you, it helps it sink in, it helps you internalize it, and it helps you recall it as well. So really good thing to do. So active listening, like I say, not a skill I was born with, something that I've had to develop, absolutely. And for me, it comes down to forcing myself to pay attention, show that I'm listening, trying to mirror, watch the energy that they're showing and try and mirror that, asking questions, clarifying, and then playing back and summarizing. So that, I think, is a great way to build emotional connection, maybe breaking apart the steps to help build an emotional connection there. Now, that is great when you are in a conversational type setting. Sometimes you're in a setting like this one here, where I am broadcasting, right? And I can't see any of you. I can't hear any of you. I've minimized the chat because I'm not a multitasker. So that's how can I make an emotional connection in that type of situation? And for me, this is about storytelling. So storytelling, I think, is a really overused word. So I'm going to try and break it apart and show you why I think it's important, and practically some steps that you can do to get better at doing at telling stories. We started right back in Aristotle, if you remember, the three means of persuasion. We talked about gravitas, you know, so credibility. We talked about emotional connection, and we talked about rationale. But if we now fast forward that into the future and we think about neuroscience, we can see that actually the stuff that Aristotle was talking about really was accurate. So here is a to scale diagram of my brain. And in there's two parts of the brain that I want to pull out. The amygdala, firstly. Now, the amygdala is just above your spinal cord, very low level part of the brain. If any of you have come across terms like, you know, fight or flight response, you know, that comes from the amygdala. Okay, so it's a very low level, quick to respond part of the brain. Another part of the brain you've got is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is at the front of the brain, and it's about forming new memories, learning, emotional processing. That's the sort of thing that your brain's doing there. Now, if you are just looking at something from a logical perspective, you're just engaging parts of your brain, okay? If you get something emotional, an emotional response whilst you're looking at something like that. So if you can get the amygdala and the hippocampus firing at the same time, what that means is you remember it more effectively. Okay, so your recall becomes better. You become more memorable. So this idea that we're not just talking about architectural diagrams, technical features, rationale, logic, but we're trying to take that and fuse that, as Aristotle talked about, to help persuade people, will also help people recall, and it will make you more memorable, which I think is a really important skill when you're trying to stand out from the competition. Okay, so storytelling does this. Storytelling is a way of getting multiple parts of the brain firing at the same time. So, excuse me. So I want to give you an example. Now, when I'm not doing webinars like this, I spend a lot of time working with teams, tech teams, pre-sales teams, coaching them and running training courses. And I talk to them about this type of stuff. And one of the exercises I get them to do is to think about how they would normally talk to their clients. And now let's try and put that in a more emotionally compelling way. And this was a great example. So what I want to read to you is firstly a paragraph that was written by somebody on the course that was the old way of doing it. Let's say just the rational type of way of doing it. And then the second way that was more of a story. And we'll kind of look at the difference. Okay. So let's start with, you know, what the type of thing that they'd have written and said before. So it's this, and I'm reading it now. The UK National Health Service needs to improve the quality of technology provided to its frontline workers. Our solution will provide a secure, scalable, and performant platform that will enable those frontline workers. The solution works by X, Y, Z. Boring. Right? It's my thought when I hear something like that. Sounds like every tech company in the world. Probably you have got a very secure, scalable, performant platform, as has everybody. And it's just a little bit dull. So the challenge that I gave them was, okay, how can we make that a bit more, how can we create more of an emotional connection? But you know, still trying to say the same sort of thing. So this is what this person came up, and I'm going to read this out to you, what they came up with. My mum is a community midwife in Lancashire. She is brilliant at helping vulnerable women prepare and bond with their unborn babies. Often, these women have the most heartbreaking life circumstances. But every day, the Wi-Fi is intermittent. The note-taking tool constantly crashes, and she struggles to book the follow-up services these women need. She's focused on troubleshooting tech issues and managing her stress levels, not providing the care that they need. And she's doing this with a diary stacked full of back-to-back appointments, with each future mum spending ages in the waiting room. That is what we want to solve. The challenges like this that are all too common in the National Health Service. We want to provide midwives and others with an easy, reliable, secure solution that lets them play to their strengths and improve the lives of others. So let me stop there and finish reading there. Two examples. One, very logical, right? This is what we do. We make a platform that does this. The other one, using creating a way of creating an emotional connection. Now, this was probably a year or more ago. I remember speaking to this lady, and I still remember it to this day. The recall that I have and the point she was making, I've still got a year later. I would have forgotten that first paragraph instantly. So this idea of being able to tell a story, create an anecdote, tell an anecdote, to connect with people so that they remember you and remember the thing that you were talking about is so important. So practically, how can you do that? And are there any top tips? Well, I think there are. So here's a few that I'm going to share with you. So these are a few tips on how to tell an interesting story, an interesting anecdote. First thing is make it relevant, right? Nobody wants to have their time wasted by a completely irrelevant story. So think of a story, and the story might be a true story. It might be a story that happened to somebody else, like the example I've done there. It might be a story that's there in the public, you know, that's a news story that everybody are familiar with. It might be something that you've made up, right? But it's something that's relevant. So first thing, make it relevant. Second thing, make it short, right? Nobody wants a 15-minute story. We're here to talk about ultimately the problem that needs solving, but keep it short, keep it punchy, and that'll engage people. A couple of minutes max normally. Make it about people. People love stories about people. The tech, the solution, is never the hero. The hero are the people involved and the impact that that tech or that solution might have. So make it about people. Give it some structure. Now, I'll come back to this actually in a minute. But give it a bit of structure, and a bit of structure can make that story really punchy, really concise, and really impactful. So I'm going to come back to that, but there is a bit of a structure that you can follow. Make it interesting. Nobody wants to listen to a boring story. You know, it needs to be something that's exciting or surprising or funny or sad or got a twist, you know, make it interesting. It needs to be interesting in some way. And the other thing is stretch the emotion. Nobody wants to hear this story, you know, I did something that was all right and it went okay and then it was over. Right? What a dull story, right? If things are bad, they are terrible. If things are good, they are great. And get this idea of stretching the emotion to bring people into the story. Use a bit of artistic license, a bit of creativity to stretch the emotion and make the story that much more interesting. So those for me would be 6 top tips to get a bit better at telling short little stories and anecdotes that you can start to use when you're talking to your customers. Now, I want to go back to the structure piece. There's loads of different frameworks out there. There's things like the hero's journey, there's the Pixar framework, there's all kinds of stuff. This for me is just the really short, simple one that's nice and easy and works for anecdotes. Okay. Every Marvel movie has got a 3-act structure. I'm guessing lots of you have watched Marvel. And that's a great little structure for us to use, right? The beginning, the middle, and the end. The setup. So in the setup, who's the hero? Who's the identifiable character that we're talking about? When's it happening? Where's it happening? What's the situation, right? So we set the thing up. Then we get to the action, the point of the story, the meat and potatoes, the thing that happens, the horror, the tragedy, the excitement, the funny thing, whatever it might be. And then it needs a resolution. What happens in the end? Did things work out for the best? Did things work out terribly? Was there this twist that meant that it wasn't what we expected? So just thinking about, how do I set this up? How do I explain the interesting bit? And how do I resolve it? Great little way to tell a story. So I'm going to pause there. We're almost halfway through. We've thought about the Cameron Tucker side. We've thought about how we build emotional connections with people. We've thought about, if we're in more of a chatty conversational way, how we exercise curiosity and use active listening to make them really understand that we are listening. And then we've thought in more of a broadcast situation where we need to articulate things, explain things, how we can use storytelling as a way to engage a bit more emotionally. So that's the first half. That needs to be paired with Lieutenant Commander data, the logical argument, okay, where we are rational, where we are data driven, when we're thinking about complex situations, because that's the reality of the tech industry that we're in, right? We can't rock up to customers, share a few jokes with them, have a great laugh, find out all about their family, and then go home. We're there to solve a problem, right? So we've got to balance those things. And so we've got to think about that logical argument. And so for me, I'm going to show you, I think, 2 really important things to think about when we're thinking about logical arguments. We need to choose the right argument, and we need to make the complex simple. Okay. I think people in our world, in the tech world, are pretty good at making logical arguments. We come from often a digital background, a technical background where things are logical, binary, you know, ones and noughts, logic, coding. We often come from that quite logical, this means this perspective. So I think we're generally pretty good at it. The challenges that I see that we are not so good at is choosing the right argument to make. And then when we make that argument, we make it too complex. So we're going to think about ways to choose the right argument and make the complex simple. Let's start with choosing the right argument. I run a podcast, don't you know? The Tech World Human Skills Podcast. Now, there is a reason I'm mentioning that. In the very first episode, which I think it's probably been going about 18 months, something like that. In the very first episode, I had this chap on. And this chap is Tony Whitehorn, and he is the former CEO of Hyundai UK. And the episode that I recorded with him was speaking to the C-suite. So it was all about how we as techies speak to the C-suite and his experience of speaking to people from the tech industry. His point was, I do not care. I need to know what we're doing. I need to know why we're doing it. I do not care how you do it. You need to give me a bit of confidence that you know what you're doing, but I do not need to know how you're doing it. I need to know what you're doing, and I need to know why you're doing it. And so I started to build out just in my mind, because I'm a very visual learner. I like to think about things visually. And I'm also a musician. And so I built out this idea of the graphic equalizer. And it's this idea of when we're speaking to somebody, how much what do we need to give them? How much why do we need to give them? And how much how do we need to give them? Now, if I'm speaking to somebody like Tony Whitehorn and I'm speaking to a senior leader, I need to give a good bit of what, right? This is what we want to do. This is what we think we should do. And I need to give them a lot of why. This is why this is going to be really important to you. You know, the business outcomes that it will drive. And I need to give very little how. And then if I start to think about that from a technical depth perspective, do I need to be really high level, you know, and not much depth? Or do I need to be really deep, you know, and explaining the complexity of how this works? And for this type of persona, I need to be really high level. So the logical arguments that I need to make to somebody like Tony would be around the why. This is why this solution makes sense. Here's the logic of why this solution makes sense. Okay, great way to think of it. Now, if I then started to change and talk to somebody else, right? So let's imagine now I'm talking to people from a more technical background, right? So as part of the buyer's decision-making process, there will be technical influencers, there'll be technical decision makers. Now, if I come at them with a load of marketecture, right? High level, just slides, high level diagrams, high level dross that lacks substance, okay, is going to lead to sort of comments like, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand the complexity of our business. So if I think of that from the graphic equalizer perspective, I'd be thinking, well, actually, I need to give them a bit of what, you know, what we're talking about. I need to give them a bit of why, but what I need to do is give them loads of how this is going to work. And I need to give that with these particular people in a lot of depth. Okay, so I need to give them details on how it's going to integrate, how it's fit for purpose, all of that kind of stuff. And depending on if you've got a really complex solution that you work with, or you're working at a very high level, that can be more or less complex. You know, I spent all of my career in tremendously complex solutions. And so therefore, the complexity was absolutely something that I needed to talk about with customers. We couldn't abstract it because it was so key to making it work and making it integrate and making it successful. So I needed to be able to go and talk about the what and the why, but I also at times needed to be able to get in there with the how and in with that depth. So the first thing that I think we can do better is to select the correct argument the correct logical argument that we want to have. Is it around the why? Is it around the how? And this graphic equalizer, I think, is a great way of thinking about it. Now, of course, like music, right? Because you could say, well, why don't I just turn them all up, right? Let's just turn them all up to max. Just imagine if you were to turn on, you know, your car radio, just turn everything up to max. You know, the bass would blow the speakers. It would sound tinny and horrible. It would just be a terrible experience. Same thing with this. If we just try and do loads of what, loads of why, loads of how, that's how we overwhelm people and just give a terrible experience. So choose the right argument based on the people that you're talking to. Be relevant to those prospects, those stakeholders. So that's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is make the complex simple. We have to talk about some complex stuff. We can't all just be sunshines and rainbows and we're going to solve the world's problems, right? We need to talk about complicated stuff with people in order for them to trust us and understand how we can actually help them. So these are some top tips that I'd give on how you make the complex simple. First thing I'd say, use simple language. Second thing I'd say, start big and funnel. That probably doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to explain that in a bit of detail. Next thing, use analogies to bring things to life. And the final thing I'd say is animate visual slides. So these would be my top tips on how you start to make and explain complicated stuff. Let me dig in to each of those for you. So simple language. Use simple language, right? It is so much easier to consume. A lot of people, get under pressure, get in a serious meeting, and then they think, I need to become this posh, weird, very educated version of myself, right? Start using very long words. Keep it as simple as you possibly can. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Firstly, if it's simple, it's easy for people to consume, internalize, and think about. That's the first thing. Secondly, you've got things like international audiences like we've got today. If I start using very specific vocabulary, very long words, then straight away I'm using language that might be difficult for a large proportion of the audience to understand. So think about how we use it, how you use really simple language. Second thing, acronyms. We are acronym-tastic in the tech world. But acronyms, again, make things harder to consume. Acronyms are often overloaded. So the acronym you're referring to is not the acronym that they are understanding. But the thing is, we use acronyms so much probably when we're in team meetings, we use and when we're chatting to our colleagues and that kind of stuff, that when we get under pressure in front of people, start getting asked questions and, under that pressure, we revert back to internal speak. We revert back to how we naturally speak, which is acronyms, the sorts of things we've been talking about with our colleagues. And actually, so it's harder to be acronym free using simple language than you might think when you're under pressure. So again, it's just something you practice. Practice, how do we talk about things as simply as we possibly can in order to make them as consumable as we can? So that's the first thing, use simple language. Second thing, start big and funnel. What am I talking about here? Well, I am not talking about a sales funnel. What I'm talking about is when you need to explain a concept that can be quite complicated, start with the big picture and then funnel into the different technical pieces you need to talk about, but always relating to that big picture. So let me give you an example with this picture here, right? Let's imagine I want to explain how a car works. Okay. So the way I would suggest you do that sort of thing is you start off by going, right, well, what's the purpose of this thing? So we've got the purpose of this thing is we need to transport things. We need to transport people. We need to get them long distances from A to B. So that's the purpose. Now, let's think about how we break that apart. So first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a propulsion system. So we're going to need a way to get moving quickly so that we can transport this thing over long distances in a reasonable amount of time. So we're going to need some kind of propulsion system. We're going to need a way to steer things. We're going to need a set of wheels to roll along, right? So I've gone big picture and then I've gone into the next level of detail. Okay, we've got this idea of an engine. We've got an idea of a steering system. We've got the idea of some wheels. Then we might start to go into the next level of detail. Right, so when it comes to propulsion, two main options. Option one, electric motor. Option two, combustion engine. How do these work? Right now, maybe we could go into what a carburetor, a gearbox, or whatever it might be that we need to do. The point is, you start at the big picture, and then if you need to go to that level of depth, and that's the first thing, identifying if you do need to go to that level of depth, based on that graphic equalizer that I was talking about earlier. If we've identified we do need to go to that level of depth, then we're going to funnel down. What I've seen a lot of technical people do is start at the real building blocks. Right, let me give you building blocks, building blocks, building block, building blocks. And then surprise, we've built a Lego house at the end of it. And that makes it really hard, in my experience, for people to consume it and to get it all in their mind. So start big. What's the big picture? Break it into logical chunks. And then depending on the level of depth you need to go to, just keep funneling down into that area, then come back up and then funnel down into that area. Propulsion system, back up, steering system, back up, whatever it might be. So start big and funnel. Really, I think, effective way to get to those really complex pieces of information that you may well need to do. Next thing, use analogies. If you can reference something in the real world that helps you explain this complicated thing that you've got, use it. And the classic example that I've seen given time after time after time over such an important topic is authentication, right? And using a passport control system, like we all go on, holiday, use our passports to travel, business travel, whatever it might be. And using that analogy of, right, how do you authenticate who you are? And that's okay. Now you get authorization and you can maybe throw in some visas, but then you're talking about access control. I don't get access to the White House just because I've got a passport. I need access, and starting to explain things that are really important for lots of people to understand is how authentication works, for example, and using an analogy that they're all familiar with, like business travel or going on holiday somewhere. So think about how you can use analogies to bring to life topics that might be new to people, but actually are very similar in principle to something that they understand very well already. So analogies is a great way to make the complex simple. And then the final thing that I want to say on this topic is about animating visual slides. And in fact, I'm not sure if the recording's still there. It might be, but about a year ago, I did a consensus webinar, which I think was recorded, where I talked in detail about visual aids and how to make really compelling visual aids. And I talked about the split brain problem. You can go and look it up if you want to. The point is, we need to explain complicated things. Visual aids, diagrams help make the complex easier to understand. But there is a problem. They are often used in a way that overwhelms and distracts an audience. We whack up something like here that's on the picture, and this is just a small part of an architectural reference diagram for an Azure solution. And people get distracted. It doesn't help them understand. They get overwhelmed, they get distracted, and it doesn't serve as a visual aid. It serves as a visual hindrance, okay? Which is why I say animate visual aids. Now, that might be you use a whiteboard, okay? And in that whiteboard, you build out a logical chunk and explain it, show how it connects to this other thing, build that out. And it's animated, right? It grows as you draw it. And so that means you can control the narrative and control the visual aid to help amplify the things that you're saying. If you're using slides and icons or downloading stuff off the AWS site or the Amazon site, sorry, the Azure site or whatever it might be, they can be very overwhelming. So think about how you use animations to almost turn it into a whiteboard, that slows down, the narrative and focuses the narrative. So think about how you use animations to hide bits and then bring the next level of bits in, the next level of icons in, and then bring the next level in, and then the next level in. So it amplifies your narrative, not hinders your narrative by distracting people and overwhelming. I think that's another thing that people can do a lot better in our world. So when it comes to making the complex simple, use simple language. Use simple language. Don't use acronyms. Try and make it as consumable as possible. Start big. Think about that car. Start about the big picture and then funnel into the appropriate level of detail. Don't start with building blocks and end up with a surprise. We've got a magic house at the end of it. Start at the top and then funnel into the detail. Use analogies, things that people will understand and are relevant in their life to understand these new complex topics. And then think about how you use visual aids to amplify what you're saying and not hinder what you're saying. So there we go. We've talked about logical arguments. Choose the right argument. Is it the why argument or is it the how argument? And then when we're explaining it, make the complex simple. Well, we are running fast out of time. So quick recap. We have been thinking about if Cameron Tucker from Modern Family and Data could physically have a baby, and of course we only take their best attributes, not the worst attributes, that would be the greatest pre-sales person of all time. Why? Because they would be able to build amazing emotional connections to all of their customers and prospects, and would also be able to explain the logical arguments really effectively. And I've given you a couple of techniques that you can take away and start using. About how we exercise curiosity and use active listening, skill I've had to learn to really help build emotional connections, or how we tell stories that get different parts of the brain firing, which means that customers and prospects are persuaded and recall better, and you are more memorable. So through storytelling. So we've thought about that. And then we've thought about this idea of the logical argument. Choose the right argument so that you are addressing the why or the how and what level of depth, and that visual slider, those graphic equalizers that help you think about that. And then make the complex simple. Think about using simple language. Think about using visual aids that amplify, not hinder, how we funnel in. So we've thought about those sorts of things. Well, what next? Well, a couple of things that I'd signpost to people. Firstly, I love working with leaders and helping them develop their team. That's what I get out of bed for. And I'd love to make their team more impactful, more successful. So if you want to book a 30-minute chat with me to understand the challenges that you're having with the team, and then some actionable things that you could take away to help elevate the game of your team, follow that QR code, follow that link. That'll take you to a site which has got my diary, my live diary. So you could book a slot this very minute if you wanted to, that suits you to have a conversation. And if you're not so much interested in that, but would like to see some of the other stuff that I've done, again, follow that QR code or that link. There's a newsletter. So every week I send maybe some inspiration, a bit of education, some things that might refresh things you already know, and that arrives in your inbox. So that goes every week. My podcast, the Tech World Human Skills Podcast, the last episode on there was all about how to thrive when you're working remotely, with Lizette Sutherland. That was really interesting to record with her. So that comes out every 2 weeks, and you can find that Spotify, Apple, wherever you want to go. And then connect with me on LinkedIn. I put loads of free content up on LinkedIn, and links to all of those if you either follow that QR code or go to that web link. Takes you to the same place. So that is it. The greatest of all time of pre-sales. If Cameron Tucker and Lieutenant Commander Data had a baby, great emotional connection, great rational arguments, and prospects would love working with them. Right, we have got time for Q&A. So, Manny, I am going to bring you back in.
I'm going to start with the first question from Sabine. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you perfectly.
So the question comes as this: my customer is often the CFO. This might be someone 30 years my senior and often a man. How do you mirror the energy when they might be very low in energy while you're bubbly and emotive by nature?
Ah, great question. So for me, this is the idea of authenticity and adapting your style, right? Um, there's loads of different psychometric tests that people might have done. Myers-Briggs is a really famous one. 16 personalities is another one. Discovery Insights. There's loads of them. My favorite is Discovery Insights. That's the one that resonates best with me. But, you know, people have all got a natural way that they like to communicate. Um, and they have got strengths in areas and weaknesses in areas. So if I think about me, in Discovery Insights, if any of you have done that, I'm a yellow. It's all color coordinated. I'm a yellow. So that means I'm quite energetic, big picture, creative, that kind of stuff. Okay. Stuff that I'm not so good at and takes more energy from me. Real detail, real processes, and thinking about how you communicate effectively the detail. So let's imagine I've got me here like that, okay, very big picture, creative, high energy. Somebody over here, very detail oriented. Uh how I communicate to them, I need to change my style, because if I just come with my natural style, it will be less impactful. Now, this strength and style I've got has got loads of strengths, also got loads of weaknesses. This one over here, loads of strengths, loads of weaknesses. And so if you're talking to people that you know are naturally going to be a very different style to you, you've got to think about how can you adapt your style in order to make that communication most effective with them. That doesn't mean you're not being authentic. It means you're being smart, and it means you're using skill to drive the outcome that you want to do. So I would probably suggest doing something like that. 16 personalities. Discovery Insights, I think, is a great one to become self-aware of what your style is, how you like to communicate, and then think about the key prospects, the key stakeholders you need to work with. What is their style, and how do you adapt so that you are giving them the stuff that they want? So if, for example, we had somebody that was very detail oriented as a CFO, for example, and I'm the opposite to me, and I'm very big picture and creative, okay, I need to be thinking about, have I thought this process through? Have I thought through all the detail? Have I got all my I's dotted, my T's crossed? Because they're going to want to know about that, and I need to get that and communicate that effectively with them. So do you think that answers the question, Manny?
I think that was a good question. And also, if for anyone, if you feel like your question needs more in depth, please reach out to Ben. He is available. These conversations don't have to just stop here. I
No.
want to move on to the next one because we do have a few. The next one is from Pedro. Pedro says, "I'm trying to figure out a quick Dame framework, not only for pre-sales team members, but for all customers facing roles. How do I balance or point out the depth each presentation requires and adapt the framework accordingly?"
Sorry, what was the very first part of that thing that you said,
Oh,
Manny?
Pedro was saying, I'm trying to figure out a quick demo framework, not only for pre-sales team members, but for all customer facing roles. How do I balance or point out the depth of each presentation requires and adapt
Yeah.
the framework accordingly?
Oh, I love it. I love a good framework. Two frameworks that I talk about a lot that might be relevant here. The first one I'm going to say is Auran. And again, the consensus webinar that I did about a year ago, I talked about that, or you can find some stuff on my LinkedIn, some links to Auran. Auran's a great framework for any conversation, whether it's a demo, a presentation, a conversation. Auran's mnemonic starts with A, audience. Okay, so who is going to be in that audience? Are we talking about high level leaders? Are we talking about technical influencers? You know, who's our audience? Second thing is objective. What is it that you want to make sure that you nail with them? So what's your objective? But flip it around. What is their objective for listening to you? Try and build some empathy to understand what they want to get out of this thing, right? And so write down who's your audience, write down what's their objective, write down what's your objective, get clarity in your mind. Then R, so Auran, R is what do you want them to remember? A few things, 3 things, 4 things. not 11 things, not 17 things, right? Just a few things. So think, what is it you really want them to remember? And again, jot that down. Next thing, so Oren, AORE, is emotion. How do you want them to feel? Do you want them to be wowed by the technology? Do you want them to be confident that they could do it themselves? Do you want them to be a bit worried at the scale of the challenge that they've got and that they need to invest some time and energy in this? I don't know. So think about how you want them to feel and how you're going to make that emotional connection. And then N is, what do you want them to do next? So after you've done this thing, what is it, the next steps that you want them to take? So I think that's a great, simple little framework, not just for demos, it applies to demos, but the others, to try and get that right level of depth that you need, and choose what things, what features you want to show, what stories you want to tell whilst you're doing the demo. Maybe that answers it, Manny.
That was awesome. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Helen has a question. How do you deal with the awkward person in the room who thinks they know everything, try and wow everyone with their technical knowledge and won't keep quiet?
Oh, right. And it happens a lot, doesn't it? Right, really. So you know, this is how I would handle the loud know-it-all. Shall we call this person perhaps the loud know-it-all? So firstly, I'd give them a few swings for free. Okay, so let them have their opinion, let them share their opinion, give them a few swings for free. And after that, maybe start to try and use something like the parking lot. I think works really nicely, you know. So are they trying to take you down rat holes? Are they asking questions that are irrelevant, that are just distracting and randomizing everybody? I quite often use the parking lot. So, you know, somebody says something, that is a great point, haven't thought about it like that before. Do you mind if I just write this down? We'll pop it on the parking lot on this whiteboard, or this virtual whiteboard. We'll pop it in the chat. Can I think about that later, and I'll come back to you later? And then you've just got this parking lot of all the things that you didn't want to talk about. The thing is, you do need to come back to them later. You do need to answer those questions. So you can try that. If they still keep going, again, try and, you know, depending what happens, I've been in those situations before, and then suddenly a break has happened, and then you've seen the other people in the meeting policing their own because you've tried to be nice, because you've used the parking lot, and they're still going. They might get policed by their colleagues that just say, "Shut up, will you? We're trying to get something valuable out of this." And so I've found that the colleagues have policed them before, and if not, you know, sometimes you just need to be direct and say, you know, "Thanks so much for sharing your opinion. We are short on time. Would you mind if I take this up with you afterwards, and we can have a one-to-one conversation after?" Again, being polite, again, being nice. What I wouldn't try and do is butt heads with them and go, you know, toe to toe. Nobody's going to win in that situation. So be the bigger person and try and use all your skills, is what I'd say.
All right, lightning round. Next question is from Sabine. Would you recommend telling stories that elicit negative emotions?
Yes, absolutely. Because that's the world that we live in. And creating that shock. So let's think about climate change, right? In order to get people to make some kind of change, they need to create an emotional connection to the impact of what's going on today, right? Talking theoretically about the grams of carbon in the atmosphere is not going to get anybody on side, but showing them the beach that they used to go to as a kid has now been washed away because the levels rise, or this island, or people that have failing food crops in whatever, elicits a negative emotion. But that is what is needed in order to compel some change. So you could apply that to all kinds of scenarios. Painting a negative picture of the tragedy allows then the solution to emerge from the tragedy. So absolutely.
All right, and final question from Pedro. I keep telling my team there is no time like answering a question for ensuring your audience's attention. Do you think this is a good approach, or should we just add more depth or structure to ensure important ideas stick?
Great question. I think it depends on the scenario that you're in. So how interactive do you want something to be? You know, I think about it in a spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum, you've got a broadcast like this, where perhaps you've got a massive audience, and if you just let everybody throw in their 2 pence whenever they want, It's going to be random. You're going to run out of time. You're not going to cover the material that you need to. Other end of the spectrum, you've just got a one-to-one conversation over a coffee where it's just chatting, it's unstructured. And so at this end, structure is required. At this end, no structure is required. And then you've got that spectrum in the middle. So if you're kind of, hey, this is a bit of a broadcast, there's some points we really need to talk to about, maybe you can sort of say, we're going to do 10 minutes to just give you an architectural overview. Then if you've got any questions on that, let us know. Hopefully we'll answer a lot of your questions. You know, sometimes you need that structure and it helps the audience along. Sometimes you need to be led. So I would say it depends. Good consultancy answer. And it depends on that broadcast structure, very structured to one-to-one, very unstructured. It depends.
Perfect. Right on the nose. I just want to thank you, Ben, for giving of your time. I think all those in the audience that stuck around for the QA. If you want more of this conversation to continue, I encourage you to please follow up with Ben online. I also see Glenn Cunningham. We did not forget your question. So, Ben, there's someone to follow up with, and I'll get with you offline. I thank you all for giving your time today. And I look forward to seeing you all at DemoFest or DFX.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye. Thank you, Manny.
Take care.